On July 29, 1981, 750 million people were invited to watch A Fairy Tale. The bells of St. Paul's Cathedral rang over London. Crowds pressed into the streets in red, white and blue. Flags waved, cameras rolled. At the centre of it all stood Prince Charles, heir to the British throne, and Lady Diana Spencer, a 20-year-old aristocrat stepping into the role the public had already begun to write for her. By widely cited estimates, the broadcast reached about 750 million viewers in 74 countries. That number matters because this was more than a wedding. It was a shared global image. The carriage, the cathedral steps, the uniforms, the veil, the balcony, the kiss. For a few hours, monarchy looked effortless, romantic, certain, a fairy tale with the whole world invited inside. The scale of that image made the ceremony harder to slow, question, or quietly undo. A private marriage can be delayed quietly. A personal doubt can stay in a room, between families, behind a closed door. This ceremony had already become public property. Watched by hundreds of millions, it grew harder to touch. Every camera, every headline, every cheering crowd added momentum before Charles and Diana ever reached the altar. That is why this wedding is still remembered with such force. The pictures were not simply false. They were real pictures of real celebration. They were also incomplete. The warning signs are not only hindsight, and they are not gossip gathered after the marriage collapsed. They appear in public footage, contemporary reporting, and later sourced accounts from people close to the events. Behind the gates, beneath the music and flags, the warning signs were already close to the two people at the center of the spectacle. Those signs did not stop the wedding because the marriage carried more than Charles and Diana's private future. It also carried what the crown needed from its heir. Behind the palace gates, Charles's unmarried life was not just a personal matter. He was the heir to the throne. That changed the meaning of marriage around him. A future king's bride was never only a private choice. She carried succession, respectability, and the public continuity of the crown. The question was not only whom Charles loved, it was who could stand beside him, produce the next generation, and make the monarchy look stable, at a moment when every royal gesture was being photographed, printed, and judged. Then Diana Spencer appeared, almost too neatly. She was young, she came from an aristocratic family with long royal connections, she had not built a public life that could compete with the institution she was entering, and on camera she offered something the monarchy badly needed: softness, shyness, warmth, and an image of innocence that the public could immediately understand. To newspapers, she could be introduced almost like a character from an older national story. The nursery assistant, the noble background, the blush, the sapphire ring, the future princess. To the palace, the appeal was more practical. Diana made the future of the crown look fresh, romantic, and secure. At this point, the fairy tale began to harden into machinery. The relationship had not yet proved it could carry a marriage, but the marriage was already carrying an institution. In February 1981, the newly engaged couple sat for the interview meant to confirm the romance. When they were asked whether they were in love, Diana answered quickly, "Of course." Charles followed with the phrase that would outlive the engagement itself: "Whatever in love means." At the time, many viewers could treat it as awkward humor, or aristocratic reserve, or a man uncomfortable with sentimental language. Heard against the demands already pressing on this match, the answer feels less like a joke than a small crack in the official picture. The crown had found a bride who solved the public problem. Whether Charles and Diana had enough private understanding to survive that solution remained unresolved. The next evidence is small enough to fit in a hand, and dangerous enough to reshape Diana's memory of the engagement. It comes from Diana's later account, recorded on tapes that became the basis for Andrew Morton's book, Diana, Her True Story, in Her Own Words. The distinction matters. This is Diana's perspective after the fact. What she said she saw, what she believed it meant, and how she remembered the pressure before the wedding. It does not make the object a complete explanation for the marriage, but it does show why, in her own telling, the danger already felt real. In that account, Diana described discovering a bracelet before the ceremony, a gift she believed was intended for Camilla Parker Bowles. The engraving, as Diana recalled it, carried initials linked to the private nicknames Charles and Camilla used for each other, Fred and Gladys. A bracelet is a small object. It can fit in a hand, vanish into a drawer, be explained away as a courtesy, a misunderstanding, a leftover from another part of someone's life. But in Diana's telling, it carried something much heavier. The sense that the official engagement story was not the whole emotional truth. Charles and Camilla had known each other before Diana entered the picture. Their connection was not a rumor invented years later, after the marriage had collapsed. It belonged to Charles's earlier emotional life, and it had not simply disappeared because the crown had found a suitable bride. That is what makes the bracelet so powerful in the historical memory of this wedding, not because it proves every motive, not because one gift can explain two people's entire future, but because it gives shape to a private fear Diana later said she already felt before the vows. The public story had room for only two people, the future king and his young bride. Diana's account suggests the emotional room was already more crowded. If that fear was already present before the ceremony, the question narrows. Why did the wedding keep moving toward the altar? The bracelet made Diana's fear tangible. But fear alone could not stop a royal wedding. By then, the date was no longer just a private promise between two people. It was becoming a public deadline. On Charles's side, the clearest account comes through Jonathan Dimbleby's authorized biography. Dimbleby describes a letter from Prince Philip that Charles understood as pressing him toward a decision. Either propose to Diana or end the relationship honorably before her reputation was damaged further. That distinction matters. It should not be turned into a scene of Prince Philip forcing his son to marry. The point is more human, and in some ways more tragic. Charles appears to have read the pressure as duty. To hesitate any longer risked looking dishonorable. To step forward meant entering a marriage about which he was not emotionally certain. Diana's later account, recorded for Andrew Morton's book, places her inside a different version of the same narrowing corridor. She said she considered stopping the wedding, but in her telling, the answer around her was that it was too late. Her face was already on the tea towels, the line almost sounds absurd, until the machinery around it comes back into view. The wedding had become an event before it had become a settled marriage. The public story had been printed, sold, scheduled, and broadcast outward. Newspapers were counting down. Souvenirs were in shops. Television plans were in motion. Millions of people were not waiting to discover whether Charles and Diana should marry. They were waiting to watch them do it. So the warning signs did not exist in a quiet room where two people could simply pause and reconsider. They existed inside a machine already moving toward July 29. For Charles, stopping could mean public humiliation, family disappointment, and the accusation that he had mishandled a young woman's reputation. For Diana, stopping could mean standing against the crown, the press, and a national fantasy that had already assigned her the role of bride. This is where the romance story starts to fail. The wedding did not keep moving because there were no doubts. It kept moving because, by the final stretch, both private doubt and public duty were being forced into the same narrow path. And once that path reached St. Paul's, the question changed. It was no longer whether the wedding could be stopped. It was what would happen when a ceremony went forward after the central people had already lost faith in it. When the bells return on the morning of July 29, they no longer sound like the opening of a fairy tale. They sound like the end of a countdown. Diana arrived at St. Paul's in the glass coach, almost swallowed by the scale of the production around her. The dress, with its enormous train, gave the day the image the world had been promised. A young bride, a royal cathedral, a future king, and a ceremony built to look timeless. But seen through what had already happened behind closed doors, the beauty of the entrance becomes harder to separate from the pressure of it. Every camera angle becomes a witness. Every step down the aisle carries more than bridal nerves. At the altar, the ceremony did what royal ceremonies are designed to do. It turned private uncertainty into public fact. Names were spoken, vows were made. The institution placed order over emotion and gave the world a clear story to repeat. Then came one of the smallest, most human moments of the day. During the vows, Diana muddled part of Charles's full name, calling him Philip Charles Arthur George rather than Charles Philip Arthur George. It was not a prophecy, and it should not be treated as a joke. Under the weight of that cathedral, that family, and that audience, a mistake like that was painfully understandable. Afterward, because so much else was already unstable, the error became symbolically loaded. In a ceremony designed to remove ambiguity, even a small stumble seemed to expose the strain beneath the polish. There was another detail that mattered more privately. In her later account given for Andrew Morton's book, Diana said she noticed Camilla Parker Bowles in the congregation, wearing pale grey. Whether seen from a distance or fixed in memory afterward, the significance is clear in Diana's telling. The person she feared remained part of the emotional reality of the day. The altar did not erase the contradiction, it formalized it, and outside the public story kept working. The crowds cheered, the bells rang, the newly married Prince and Princess of Wales appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, and the kiss gave newspapers and television exactly the image they needed. For that moment, the wedding had succeeded. The world saw romance, continuity, and royal certainty. Then the crowd noise begins to fade and a harder question is left behind. What happens when an image that powerful can no longer contain the truth beneath it? After the balcony, the image appeared to have done its job. The marriage produced heirs. Prince William was born in 1982, Prince Harry in 1984. In dynastic terms, the future of the line looked secure, and for a time, the image held. The young Princess of Wales, the future king, the children, the photographs that seemed to confirm continuity. The contradiction sealed at St. Paul's did not disappear. It moved into the marriage, and eventually it moved into public view. In 1992, Charles and Diana separated. By then, what had once been managed behind palace walls had become front-page history. The private failure of the marriage was no longer just a family matter. It was a test of the monarchy's honesty, emotional judgment, and relationship with the public that had been invited to believe in the fairy tale. Then, in 1995, Diana gave the line that fixed the hidden fracture in public memory. Speaking about Camilla, she said, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." A year later, in 1996, Charles and Diana divorced. That sequence changed the meaning of the 1981 wedding. The spectacle had not failed on the day itself. It had worked brilliantly, giving the crown a global triumph, a future line of succession, and an image of renewal watched by hundreds of millions. The wound opened later, when the public learned how much private incompatibility had been covered by duty, ceremony, and royal symbolism. The wedding of the century was therefore more than a romance that went wrong. It was a public victory built over a private fracture. And when that fracture finally became visible, the victory itself became part of the crisis. The question remains behind the gates and beneath the balcony image. What does a monarchy risk when it asks human beings to live first as symbols and only afterward as themselves?